Good evening, everybody. It's, I guess, good morning here in London. What I wanted to talk about today is for those of you that haven't seen it, we did a launch with the PSA of the Wellbeing campaign, and there's an introduction to universal basic services there. But I think there are a couple of questions that come up around this. One of them is, how can we afford to do this kind of thing? And the other one is perhaps how does it relate to alternatives that people might be more familiar with or have heard more about, which would be something like the universal basic income. So I wanted to sort of unpack the arguments about UBS in relation to taxation and what we can afford. And hopefully what I will show you is that UBS is fundamentally about efficiency. And I'll explain why in the larger context we feel that that is such an important goal as part of getting to resilience. So that that's not just sort of economic efficiency, but also sort of social efficiency and environmental efficiency. And all of those are going to determine our future tax rates. So if I just recap quickly the sort of three main points that we would put forward as the sort of arguments for UBS. The first one is that we need to enable every citizen to reach their potential. We need to be able to figure out a way in which our society can afford to deliver the infrastructure that individuals cannot build for themselves. And we need to do all of this within boundaries that are not of our choosing. And the sort of main and most obvious one there is the boundaries that are set by the planet. Now, if we unpack those three arguments, there are sort of major themes behind that. The first one is to understand that the kinds of societies we live in, and I am going to talk here about what would be generally called the developed world, by which we mean societies and economies that have developed highly specialized and very complex economies and societies that need to maximize the potential of all of those of the people, not just because it's a great idea for those people, but because the society as a whole has become large and complex, and we need everybody to make their best contribution in order to keep the whole system working. So that means maximizing the support for all kinds of work, all of the different roles that need to happen inside a large and developed economy. And as well as maximizing the support for that kind of work, which we would generally use the term, and I will use the term safety to refer to that portion of our effort as we go through this discussion. The second thing is that we also need to motivate everybody, right, to fill all of these different roles. And that we use the word opportunity to refer to that sort of general area of need that we need to pay as much attention to. So the second point is that a large and complex society has a very dense infrastructure content. So on a physical level, we have energy, transport, sanitation, all sorts of physical infrastructure that is absolutely essential to the economy, and also essential to the society. And all of that needs to be not just built, but also maintained over the years, improved as technologies come along. There's a second area that a modern developed economy absolutely needs to maintain, and that's the support for all of the specialists. And largely what that comes down to is our sort of educational training and research infrastructure. All of this larger than any individual can provide, but we need to have that infrastructure in place to be able to continue to service the physical infrastructure. And then we also have an institutional infrastructure, decision-making, law, that kind of thing, that is also, essential to the other two. So it's a very dense thing to maintain a developed society. And we don't actually really have the option of backing out from that. I would call it a ratchet, that the process of development has great benefits, but it also comes with consequences and costs. And this complex infrastructure that we have to maintain is the consequence of that. And if we fail to do the maintenance of the safety kind of infrastructure, then we can't support the developed economy that we expect to run on top of that. So it's not really an option to downgrade. We can talk more about that if you have questions about that, but by which I mean, you know, of course you could downgrade, but you know, no one's going to want to do that. And then, of course, there are these boundaries that are not of our choosing, and we tend to talk mostly about climate as that boundary that we have to fit within, and that is absolutely true. But I'm going to try and make a slightly parallel argument here that actually the level of taxation is not substantially something that we can choose either. Because, referring back to what I just said, a large and complex developed society and economy has an infrastructure that is essential to its maintenance. And that infrastructure, as you go over time, is more and more collective, shared, and cannot be built by any individual. And that tax is effectively the boundary between safety and opportunity. It's the how much of our total output in our economy are we prepared to assign to that safety infrastructure that supports the specialized economy, that enables motivation. So these are safety and opportunity are two sides, they're two portions of a single whole. And I'm going to try and walk you through now the fact that taxation, which is kind of, you know, comes out of what we take from compensation. So it's a nice proxy for the choice that we make as a society about how much of total effort, total output we're going to allocate to that shared infrastructure. You know, I'll make the point that this is something that it doesn't happen once in a development cycle, right? The infrastructure, whether it's physical or social or institutional, all needs to be maintained and kept up to date as you go along. So this becomes a sort of constant balance that a developed society has to continually manage the balance between developing all of this infrastructure and maintaining it, but also keeping a level of motivation so that there are specialists who are able to go and fill all of the roles. And we use the term specialists in the broadest sense. And so my description of a specialist is any person who is gravitating towards their particular skills and abilities. That qualifies as a specialist. So I don't mean it in a narrow sense, but in a larger sense. So taxation then, we would argue, is largely a factor of the development of your economy. And I'm going to not share very many slides today, but I am going to share one now. And so that we can see how this has developed. In this case, we're looking particularly at the UK economy. So this is a, you know, technically it is a chart of what they call government revenues as a percentage of GDP, but what that basically means is how much of the economy is being assigned to taxation. Over 200 years in the UK, and luckily we have the Bank of England has kept pretty good data on this, and so we can map out a chart like this. And so there are a couple of things that I would point out, which is, you know, up until the beginning of the 20th century, average tax rates in the UK were around 10% of GDP. We then hit the First World War and the 1920s afterwards, the consequence of that, and we introduce a level of social support that was an enhancement on what we had before. And we get something like a 15% jump in the amount of taxation. Largely those programs were insurance programs. We then come to another solidarity event, as I'll call them, the Second World War, after which we introduce welfare states and we add, you know, another chunk of taxation. And that is, you know, largely where things have stayed. And funnily enough, that's in fact, the OECD average right now is at around 32%. That applies to the UK and New Zealand. We're actually, New Zealand and the UK slightly under the OECD average in terms of how much of the economy we are taking out in taxation to spend on collective infrastructure. So the point that I hope that you can see from this is that there are stages in the development of the economy, particularly the late development of an industrial and then technical economy, where there is infrastructure and social, institutional, and physical infrastructure that commands a higher portion of the economy to be dedicated to it. And so, of course, these were political decisions. You could say, in the 1920s, that was a political decision. The building of the welfare state by the Labour Party in, 45 was a political decision. But was it? What was the alternative? If they hadn't done that, would the economy have grown? Would they have been able to sustain the level of development? And so we would argue that underneath this, in fact, there are larger currents that are running where a level of development in a society demands an allocation towards the shared infrastructure of that society in order to support an advanced economy. So I will perhaps, I was going to say, I'm not going to leave that up there. I will stop that share, but I'm happy to put the chart back up there. Now, what happened as we go along in this chart is that we hit the 1970s. And it's a very interesting period, but I would sort of summarize it as saying that what actually happened was that growth slowed and prices rose. But the analysis at the time was that motivation had been unduly impinged on, and that we were overspending on the safety portion, and that therefore what we needed to do was to reduce spending on safety so that we could increase motivation. And so the idea at that time was that we could move some of this safety requirement off the public balance sheet into the private balance sheet. And that by encouraging private individuals to save, that we would then be able to reduce the amount that the public expense would be in the future when those people came to retire. So we're effectively replacing a social contract with a savings contract. But there's a real problem here, which is that actually savings don't come out of motivation, right? When if you say to someone, the society is not going to be there for you as much as you may have thought it was going to be, you need to save for yourself now. When people make those savings, they don't take those out of their opportunity portion. They are effectively a safety. It's a replacement. I'm now being asked to make a provision for my own private safety as opposed to a collective safety which won't be there. So the natural consequence of that is that it leads to pressure on taxation. It has to come out of that same portion of society that is being allocated towards the safety portion. And so it was sort of fairly natural that the mantra of the post-70s, 1980s was this small states, low taxes, free enterprise. That there is a correlation here that was proposed at the time as a solution to this balance between how much society allocates to safety and opportunity. But of course, it didn't actually change that balance, right? So the savings is still part of our safety allowance. What it actually did is it reduced collective safety. It pushed society to create space for people to create private savings, and it did that by reducing the allocation to collective safety. The actual costs of old age, the cost of providing safety in society, whether it's today or in the future, is actually not determined by politics, right? It's a factor of how developed is the society, how complex is the economy, how advanced have people got. It also comes with the expectations that people have for their lives. So as societies develop, people's expectations change. And this isn't just the expectations of people who are doing really well. It's everybody in society's expectations change. The quality of the physical infrastructure. We expect to have good housing. We all expect reliable energy, clean water, good food. We all need support for all of the work that needs to go on. And, it's one of the things that I really loved about the PSA launch was this focus on the essential frontline workers and, what was going to be needed to support them in these kinds of situations to increase the resilience of society. that all becomes, that's a generalized expectation in society. And thankfully, luckily, as societies develop as well, people develop kind of higher aspirations for the extent to which they participate in the decision-making process. Democracy becomes very important. And again, the argument here is that this is not substantially a political choice. The politics has to react to this situation. So as the society develops, what the participation portion throws up is political initiatives that will fulfill that need in society. So the real problem then in this framework that we would argue is the ongoing need for a society to balance between these two equally essential portions of what has to be assigned out of the economy. And the alternative of small state low taxes is actually a crude misunderstanding of that problem, because it actually doesn't change that balance. All it does is it moves some portion of the provision of safety from the public sphere to the private sphere, but it doesn't actually change the balance between these two. And that as a society develops, there will become a point of competition here, that the infrastructure, the social needs of society are large enough and complex enough and are of a shared nature that individuals cannot provide for themselves, that there will come this point, and I'll talk a little bit, you look across the world about different levels of taxation rates, but there is a point at which these two become in tension, is I think the word that I would put it. And the answer in that situation is not to diminish one or diminish the other, because they're both essential. You can't diminish motivation, because otherwise you end up not being able to fulfill all of the roles in your society and you don't maintain your development. You can't diminish the safety allocation because you diminish the capacity of the society to be developed. So efficiency, or efficacy, which is a kind of better word, because what it does is it combines the idea that not only are you efficient in how you deliver things, but you are sufficient, that you do this to a level that is necessary. So how do we meet safety and opportunity needs most efficiently? And this is what the Universal Basic Services proposal is effectively pointing at. How do we allow every citizen to reach their potential? How, as a society, can we afford to provide what individuals cannot for themselves? And how do we do that within the boundaries of the planet and the boundaries of the society and our expectations that we're in? And we believe that the answer to that is sort of, is kind of not rocket science. In some ways, this is very basic economics, which is we need more shared resource use. That we need to maximize the economies of scale that are available. We need to minimize duplication. We need to minimize waste. We need to banish information asymmetries as much as we can. And we need to provide a visible and real reassurance that the social contract can be relied on in order to take fear out of the sort of motivation calculation that individuals make. And that's what allows them to transition to less material motivation, so that they are pursuing, in the absence of fear, their particular desires in life, and then get meaningful and satisfying work becomes the motivation more than sort of collecting material. So Universal Basic Services looks to do that. It looks like, how can we as an economy, focus on scale, remove duplication, and do that? And what are the areas in which we could do that? Now, perfectly willing to accept that marketplaces are effective ways of arbitrating through particularly moving goals that you can't sort of make that decision centrally in the way that a communist state might try to, and you want people to work through the options so that the best one emerges out of the pile. But there are a set of basic needs in society: housing, transport, the sorts of things that we put into basic services, that we would argue are not well served. They don't need to be in creatively destructive markets with competition, What they need to be is effectively just delivered, and delivered at the lowest cost. And that's how you will keep taxation down over the long run. So I'll turn then briefly to the idea of a basic income and ask, in the context of the sort of format that I've just provided, in these existential problems about how we arbitrate the balance in society between safety and opportunity, does a few more dollars in people's pockets actually solve any of those existential problems? And the conclusion that we would come to is it doesn't on its own. It could only if it was on top of a well-established social security infrastructure. And this is well documented by people who have spent a lot, who've dedicated their lives to universal basic income research. And in fact, there's a parallel book, The Case for a Universal Basic Income, that's out from Polity Press in the same series that Anna Coote and my book on universal basic services. And I know Louise. And Louise is very adamant that a basic income will not succeed unless it is effectively launched into a society that has universal basic services. That, there are particular kind of areas like housing and environmental impact that basic income doesn't have any solutions for. So the consequence of taking money and assigning it to a basic income is effectively, again, if we look at this in the model of safety versus opportunity, what is a society, what is a government, what is the politics going to determine that a small basic income is about? Well, it's about safety. So what would you do? Well, you would take that budget out of the budget that you would otherwise assign to providing collective and shared safety. So it's very difficult to imagine a situation in which a basic income doesn't detract from the budget that would be assigned to collective security. And yet it is only possible for a basic income to succeed if that collective infrastructure is maintained at quite a high level. If we look at a large basic income, then everybody who's done the math, you consume such large portions of the budget that not only does that sort of work in a small scale, works in a really large scale, like how do you have any money left over for that? And we don't find that there are people sort of outside of the more radical right in America that are campaigning for a very large basic income precisely for that reason, because it makes such an obvious impact on the total budget that's available. So, where basic income tends to get its traction and where its strongest hand, right, is that it speaks to individual freedom. And whenever the conversation turns to that, then the idea that putting more money in people's pockets gives them individual choice is the kind of strong point of that argument. But the trouble is, if your social infrastructure is weak, if your society is unequal, if your politics are unstable, what good is a little bit of extra personal freedom within a society that's non-functional? So whether it's even on the sort of strong points that it sits, a basic income has some fundamental flaws. And it's to do with this relationship of every individual actually sits inside a larger society. In the context of that society, particularly in a developed, advanced, modern society, the context is has more effect on the individuals who are living in that society than the individual circumstances. And then turning to taxes, and I hope that what I've been able to say so far has given you some idea here that we're going to need to focus on efficiency, either now or later. So both New Zealand and the UK, we come in, our tax rates are below, as I said, the OECD average. There are countries in the world, and we tend to think of them as the Scandinavians or the Northern European countries, that have tax rates that are much closer to 50%. And you could certainly make an argument that the most developed, sophisticated societies that our culture is going to produce will have tax rates higher than that. And I see no problem in advocating for that. But even once you get to that level, if you look inside those societies that are already taxing at 40% plus, this tension remains, which is how do you sufficiently satisfy the social needs of the society? And so we're gonna have to focus on this level of efficiency in our social provision, whether we're at the tax rates of 35% that we are now, or even if tax rates go up by 10%. This problem will not go away. So I think by all means, fight for a greater allocation towards collective safety, and that means more taxation. But don't believe that that is going to banish the problem and mean we won't continue to have this discussion.